where in fact, and this is a, this is a long debate, and in fact you can find going all the way back to arguments of the workers' opposition during the Bolshevik Revolution, also about autonomy of workers, autonomy of trade unions, autonomy of social movements, and so on. So I think this is there's a curious relationship then if we read Jameson's provocation back through this debate. He wants to present dual power as a critique of contemporary political theory. Jameson's argument is specifically one against the fetishization or obsession with politics in contemporary theory. So he's fascinated by the idea of dual power because it puts the focus on the socioeconomic dimension of transition and leaves aside what I think he sees as a kind of fetish or aestheticization of politics in the likes of Badiou or Rancière and so on and so forth. But I think it's interesting too that if we look at that Bolshevik or communist debate, that dual power is also a critique of political theory in another sense, because it's a deeply political and deeply strategic notion, but one which itself challenges its status as a theorizable concept. That's why I'm also very suspicious of the ways in which, at different points through the 20th century, people have tried to present dual power as a kind of recipe or as a sort of strategy in its own right. This tension within the idea of dual power was very interestingly developed by a Bolivian Marxist theorist, René Zavaleta Mercado, who writes a book called Dual Power in Latin America, whose main focus is the experience of popular and workers' power in Bolivia in the 1950s and in Chile in the Allende period. He writes the book as, in a sense, fleeing the coup in Chile and publishes it around 74. I think the book is finished around that period. And Zavaleta Mercado and he in fact produces what is in a sense one of the only, if not the only book that's only around the question of dual power. And again, criticizing its status as a theoretical concept, he actually refers to it, which is, I think, potentially productive, as a Marxist metaphor. Not as a Marxist concept, but as a metaphor in the sense of something that stands in for a complexity or anomaly or an aberration which doesn't allow the relationship between a concept and its cases, let's say. He says it's a Marxist metaphor that designates a special type of state contradiction or a state conjuncture of transition. And this is where, interestingly, Zavaleta Mercado engages mildly, in a mildly sectarian way, I suppose, but nevertheless, in a juxtaposition of the ways in which Lenin and Trotsky theorize dual power, emphasizing actually their differences. The gist of this being that while in Lenin the emphasis is on the strategic aberration or anomaly that dual power is, and of course Lenin at different points and in different ways, not just about dual power, is constantly stressing the extreme, over-determined anomaly and singularity of what's happened in the Soviet Union, which of course makes Leninism as a political faith a particularly weird formation. There's still people in England who think you can actually, address, every political conjuncture by thinking, what would Lenin have done in 1917, and given, Lenin's fairly explicit statements about the non-generalizable character of just about everything that was happening in the Soviet Union in that period, it makes that position problematic, to say the least. Zavaleta Mercado argues that for Lenin, the phenomenon of dual power between February and October is an extremely singular exception to revolutionary theory as previously conceived. And it's, in a sense, a kind of stubborn and anomalous fact, an unpredictable fact, that itself demands the invention of new forms of organizational and strategic response. On the contrary, at least as viewed by Zavaleta Mercado, for Trotsky, dual power is what, in fact, Trotsky himself calls a social law of revolution. So these are radically different conceptions. And in fact, in various of his texts, Trotsky will go back through the history of revolutionary conflicts and find moments of dual power in 1789, 1830, etc., etc. Whilst for Lenin, there is no history of dual power. Because for dual power to be dual power, just to recall that, it has to be the asymmetrical conflict between two different types of power. So the horizontal conflict between two wings of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, or between two ways of running the state, is not dual power in Lenin's conception. So there is no social law, and in fact there is no theory of dual power. There's just a strategic practice of responding to this fact. And Zavaleta Mercado tries to argue that, contrary to this idea of dual power as social law, dual power is, as he puts it, a qualitative contemporaneity, as well as the antagonistic or conflictual development of two asymmetrical and incommensurable powers. So two powers interlocked in the same process, but in this deeply asymmetric way, or in fact, it's at an even more more developed sense, the idea of the uneven conflict between what he calls two revolutions. In that case, the congenitally malformed bourgeois revolution and this larval proletarian one. So in that sense, because of its political overdetermination, there is no law of dual power. In fact, there is no theory of dual power, and there is no knowledge of dual power. There's, in a sense, a description and a strategic intervention into this context. Now, I think one of the phenomena that has taken place in terms of the development of theories of crisis and revolution has been, in a sense, this a kind of forgetting, or a kind of black boxing of the question of dual power. And I think we can approach this displacement of dual power as a state crisis of transition through the debates and the shifts that the concept has undergone. The US Army is the only place in the United States that actually has social security and a functioning public health and pension system, and then arguing in a kind of modest proposal way for this, universal conscription of everybody between 18 and 65 that would make the army collapse into an alternative sort of social welfare state. This is the short version of his science fictional argument. But what I think is curious in Jameson's argument is that he presents his speculative utopia of dual power as one in which the embryo of dual power exists for a protracted period simultaneously with the institutions and apparatuses of the state. So that in this diffuse model of dual power, you wouldn't have a war of maneuver in the Leninist mode, you wouldn't have a war of position, you would have something, and this is actually oddly a term that Kautsky used, like a war of attrition. and slowly sap the energies of the state in the building of a parallel economic and social organization. And I think what's intriguing, if we then go back to the debate of the 70s, is that to some extent, if you look at the debate, for instance, in the late 70s between Poulantzas and Henri Weber in the New Left Review and elsewhere, about transition and dual power, Poulantzas's vision is one of this longue durée war of attrition within the state, about slowly capturing or undermining the hold of the bourgeoisie over the structures of the state, and refusing that moment, which of course for Lenin was defining of dual power, which was a moment of rupture and indeed of frontal confrontation. If you remember, if there cannot be two powers in a state, then short of one of those powers more or less evaporating, some form of rupture and conflict is inevitable. And this exchange between Poulantzas and Weber is played out along this axis, where Weber says, yes, of course, we can engage in this long war of attrition, we can subtract or capture aspects of the state and of socioeconomic institutions, but at one point or another, there will have to be a rupture, a reckoning, a break. The war of attrition eventually meets some kind of limit. And I guess this is viewed from that standpoint, the anomaly of Jameson's argument is that he tries to combine the long duration of what was imagined by the likes of Poulantzas in the late 70s with the maintenance of a strong duality. And here we enter, I think, also into a domain which is the domain of the debates over dual power, or at least over the plurality of power, and over transitions that have taken place in a more recent context, for instance, in Latin America, in debates around the nature and character of popular communes in Venezuela, and so on and so forth, where you instead get further anomalies, which is the anomalies of ways of thinking socialist transition, in a sense, contemporaneously from above and from below, certainly in the Venezuelan case, from the state, which is not only mandating but making possible certain forms of social organization, namely by redirecting oil profits and the like, and then movements from below for alternative forms of social organization. George Cicarella-Maher, a friend, has written a very interesting book called We Created Chavez. It's a popular history of the Venezuelan process or the Bolivarian revolution, in which he also tries to reinvent this conception of dual power. And again, it's not a dual power either of a Leninist or a Trotskyist variant. It is what I would call a kind of diffuse dual power, in order to account for this peculiarly articulated relationship between the state and popular endeavors. And I think, and I guess just by way of conclusion, I mean, I think one of the curiosities of dealing with these debates about transition and debates about dual power, is the question of how, what relationship one has to prior forms of political invention and political experimentation in the history of the global left. Recently, Kristen Ross presented her book on the political imaginary of the Paris Commune at Goldsmiths, where I work. She was very adamant, that the last thing one should do is to think that one can draw lessons from history, and indeed draw lessons from the Paris Commune, that one could apply these experiences. I think in many ways that's right, and I think it's particularly right if we really accept, which I think in many ways we must, that character of aberration or anomaly or singularity that, as I argued, Zavaleta Mercado draws out of Lenin's concept, which is not really a concept of dual power. Having said that, I also think it would be very limiting not to explore the very rich history of what I have called diffuse dual power, the very rich history of experimenting in various contexts with the generation, the practice of asymmetrical types of power. And the ways in which, in different moments, these involve different articulations with both the state and the law. Recently, for instance, there's been a spate of very interesting politically oriented historical research on the whole experience of poder popular, or popular power, in Chile under Allende, with really fascinating archival work that shows the complex tensions, of what it meant to try to create this asymmetrical type of power, whilst not being in a confrontation with the state, because the state in this context, like to some extent in Venezuela perhaps, was a state that was partly sympathetic to the constitution of asymmetrical forms of power, if obviously partly trying to rein them in. And we can find other moments also in the 20s, go back to the work of Karl Korsch on the socialization of the economy and on councils, or even in the late 70s, as I argued, to these curious moments of using the concept of dual power, or at least duality of power, even by the likes of Althusser and Sartre. I think the curiosity of our condition, I suppose, is that, and this was the title of the longer version of this, in this book about Jameson's essay, is that whilst Lenin found himself in this interregnum between February and October, that we in many ways find ourselves after October, in the sense of, in the long legacy of all of these revolutionary debates and revolutionary conceptions, but before February, in the sense that even in situations like Spain and Greece and elsewhere in the present, there hasn't been the kind of break in the consistency or in the structure of the state that would make the kind of debates that Lenin was involved in, and that the Bolsheviks were involved in that period, concrete. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have a discussion about these matters. So, thank you.
Şöyle bir şey düşünebilir miyiz? Bu Lenin Paris Komünü üzerine. Lenin Paris Komünü üzerine seçme yazılarındaki notlarında Engels'in Fransa'da iç savaş metnine yazdığı ön sözden hareketle şöyle bir ifade kullanıyor. Proletarya henüz yönetemiyor, burjuvazi artık yönetemiyor. Burada acaba henüz ve artık ifadeleri üzerinden bir zamanlama sorunu olarak bunu olumsal zorunluluk bağlamında değerlendirebilir miyiz? Siz öngörülemezlik olarak bahsetmiştiniz tanımlamanızın birisinde. Buradaki henüz ve artık geçişe karşılık geliyor olabilir mi? Stratejik bir momente geliyor ama zamanlama olarak nereye yerleştirebiliriz ikili iktidarı?
Expression not ready or not able is an interesting one because, of course, the affirmation of the presence, the co-presence of two asymmetrical types of power in this moment of crisis also raises a question which we could call a kind of question of political pedagogy or political education. One of the things that makes the concept of dual power in the Marxist tradition different than political concepts of the crisis of power or even of civil war has to be the claim that that there are capacities and that there are social practices amongst workers in this case which already lend them a power that is in some sense alternative to or antagonistic to that of the state of capital. The curiosity, I suppose, of the Marxist and indeed of the so-called Leninist tradition about this issue is the contradictory weight of a theory, just as a theory that you can find in Marx, of course, to an extent, the theory that the proletariat is educated by capital, in the sense that the proletariat is organized, is concentrated, and is in some sense taught by the very mechanisms of exploitation. So that's an aspect of that theory. And it's the fact that workers have this lived, even if brutalizing experience of the factory system, for instance, that actually gives them a power that atomized or isolated workers in other sectors wouldn't have. And this is a historical experience that, you know, happened in most of the revolutionary processes we know of. So I was just reading about the Portuguese Revolution of 1974, and one of the things that made it possible for people to get rid of their bosses and start running their own factories is that they knew how to run their own factories. So that's not insignificant at all in terms of power, because it's not, and I think this is very important, it's not a simply political conception of power, it's a conception of social power and of organization. So this is hence the concept of the embryo or the state in potentia. Thank you. Now that's very contradictory, because of course the factory also organizes the powerlessness of workers. It also divides them, it hierarchizes them, it pits them against each other and so on. So that's, I think, in order to think through the source of dual power in the experience of exploitation, one would have to think through this contradiction. And one of the curious aspects of the first years of Bolshevism is that actually most of its focus, certainly most of Lenin's focus, all the way to his death, seems to be on political pedagogy of workers, which is separated from the domain of production. And I think there's a lot of strength in the left critiques, let's say, of the experience of the first years of Bolshevism. There's a great book by Robert Linard, ex-student of Althusser, French Maoist, called Lenin, the Peasants, and Taylor. And the whole book is really about the fact that there was this very schizophrenic relationship to the working class, which involved their domination in their factory and their liberation in the political sphere. So a worker had to both become capable of administering the state, that was at least Lenin's conception, but at the same time, it wasn't a situation of self-management. The Soviets had no real power in the factories themselves and so on. So I think that's where the concept really starts to somewhat come apart. And I guess in terms of, I mean, I wonder in terms of that quote, I mean, whether anybody is ever ready to rule. I mean, where readiness is what kind of political concept is that? Because in some sense, to be fully ready, one would already have to be able to. One would already be ruling, in some sense. So, I don't think. At the same time, I do think that there's a strong trend within within the Marxist tradition to have a very linear understanding of what it means to be able to rule, and not to quite deal with those, strategic contradictions. So the workers who can really run the factory are not necessarily the ones who want to take over the factory, or that the ability. So there's a kind of fantasy that you would have the perfectly able and perfectly revolutionary class just waiting in the wings, and then then you just you decapitate the power structure, and then all of a sudden everybody's, and sometimes even Lenin describes a whole situation like that. For instance, talking about banks. He says, oh yeah, well, capitalism has done all the work for us because of course it's centralized and concentrated the economy, and we just have to remove the leading cadres. And obviously the situation is more complex than that.
Komünist İdeya Konferansı'nda bir sunum yapmıştınız. Türkçe de kitap olarak basılmıştı. Orada kanımca diğer makalelerden biraz daha farklı bir makale yazmıştınız. Ya da sunum yapmıştınız. Diğerleri daha çok bir fikri hatırlamaya yönelik yazılmış veya düşünülmüşken, sizinki daha geleceğe dönük bir sunumdu. Oradaki iddianız, hatırladığım kadarıyla, tabii burada da daha açabilirsiniz. Komünizm, hani ideasından çok, belki de işte komünizm sorusunu sormanın daha önemli olduğunu bugün için gibi bir fikirden bahsediyordunuz. Ben yani sunumunuzu okuduğumda özellikle bu prefigüratif politikayla çok ilgili olduğunu düşünmüştüm. İşte dual power meselesinin o makalede de belirttiğiniz komünizm sorusu ile ikisini hani biraz daha yorumlar mısınız? Özellikle de yani hani burada işte geliştirdiğiniz ya da işte düşündüğünüz işte prefigüratif politika, bir yandan da işte devlet iktidarı konusuyla ilgili mesela bu sizin burada açıkladığınız geçiş tartışması, hani sanki hani oldukça detaylandırılabilir ilginç bir tartışma. Teşekkür ederim. To ask which actually is, you know, it is something a democratic thing, but it expands, etc. This is, you know, how to solve this question.
Okay.
And this is, you know, when I read it, I find it very related to prefigurative politics, but, you know, prefigurative politics has probably different meanings in, you know, in United States or here, etc. But, for example, now you develop a question kind of different way, or in, you know, different terminology that with the transition, and I find it quite interesting. You know, can you, connect this to, especially in context of prefigurative politics or, you know, scheduling the state?
Okay.
Yeah.
The argument that I made in that paper is not immediately present to me, so you'll forgive me for trying to improvise a little bit of a response. What I do remember, which is a somewhat amusing anecdote, is that book was, when they translated it into French, it was reviewed by some ex-communist but now very right-wing guy in Le Monde des Livres. And it was slightly flattering because he said the article was, you know, of course, about how terrible it is that all these people are thinking about communism again and why don't they stop, etc., etc. And but then it had this very nice sentence, and it said, well, at least that Toscano guy is honest because he tells us it's about power, and all the other ones are talking about ideas and they make it seem really friendly, and, you know, so I had given away the fact that this was some really sinister project to actually change things. So I guess I'm personally interested in the various discussions and formulations of dual power, which, again, as I tried to argue today, I don't think can be summarized into a kind of theory in the sense of some sort of, you know, strategic recipe, but I think it's an interesting problem, and it's partly an interesting problem because it links the necessarily prefigurative aspect of any oppositional emancipatory politics, which is, kind of goes back to this question of political education and pedagogy and the like, that it links it to this otherwise absent problem of transition. And one of the limitations of many current discussions about the prefigurative is that they enter, in a sense, into a discourse, sometimes a self-satisfied discourse of the enclave, of a kind of enclave politics, and sometimes a sort of slightly deliriously optimistic discourse about, you know, the slow molecular transformation of everyday life, which will eventually, you know, remove the constraints of the state and law and capital and so on. So I think the virtue of those debates, and also the virtue of the extremely, you know, concrete, pragmatic ways in which those questions were answered in very singular and unrepeatable conditions in Bolivia in the 50s and Chile in the 70s, etc. I think, whilst not having any lessons like, oh, we should do what they did then, etc., at least give one a sense of the complexity of the relationship between the transformation of everyday life and the state and the law, that either the Leninist recipes or the kind of you know, anarchist kind of imaginaries of politics, I don't think do, because I don't think actually that they pose how complex and severe those problems are. In fact, that they make those problems seem much simpler, which is precisely what comes out in reading about the period of Poder Popular in Chile, or even reading about the very complex situations of popular commons in Venezuela today, etc., is precisely the way in which they're constantly trying to articulate this relationship to the state on the one hand, and this transformation of everyday life and social relations on the other. So I guess, and that's why I also find it perplexing, I guess, to go back to the idea of communism question, that this is generally posed in something like this way. It's like, well, everybody is, this is a kind of Badiou sort of version. Of course everybody is against, everybody thinks that capitalism is terrible, so that's a kind of, left consensus, but no one has some, affirmative, disciplined and lucid idea of what there would be in its place. The reason why I turned to the Jameson piece is because I think it's interesting, given that he's the guy who made famous the now common Zizek line of the, we can imagine the end of nature, we can imagine the end of capitalism, etc. So the question is like, well, why can't we? I think what's interesting about this piece of Jameson's in a sense is, well, because actually we can't imagine what the forms of transition from capitalism would be. And I think that's a much more complex imaginative and practical problem than asserting, radical equality as a principle. Now, of course, that opens up a complex issue because by the very argument I've made, it's, I've made a quite abstract argument about why abstract arguments are difficult to make in a sense, about posing those problems of dual power and transition as theoretical problems has serious limitations. Of course, they could be posed as theoretical problems in the 1970s to an extent, because for better or for worse, there existed states that presented themselves as still somehow being linked to an actual transitional project. So when Charles Bettelheim writes, the transition to a socialist economy, he is consulting with the Chinese government and the Yugoslavs, etc. And we might say it was a terrible state capitalist experiment or whatever, but it was a kind of also a material space within which those imaginaries could function. And outside of the very, very sketchy situations in which this takes place in some countries in Latin America at present, those questions are not really being asked in that way. And I think what happens, and this is again where I'm sympathetic to Jameson saying, well, we actually have to maybe stop fetishizing politics as a separate domain of emancipation or affirmation, etc., is that even in those contexts, it's actually much easier in a sense. I mean, if you take the case of Venezuela, which I don't have extremely detailed understanding of, but I try to read about it to some extent. But what seems evident there is that actually the principal transformations are at the level of political consciousness, and they're not at the level of social relations. That in some sense, when the blockage of actual transition in terms of social forms and in terms of relations of production and the like can have, within a relatively positive context like that of an explicitly socialist government, can have the result of compensating for the fact that actually the class structure in Venezuela is the same and factories work in quite similar ways, and it still has one of the lowest taxations in all of Latin America and so on and so forth, by emphasizing the kind of domain, the moment of consciousness or the moment of subjectivity. And I'm not denying that that's significant, but I think we have this sort of tendency to put all of the emphasis, I guess, and that's maybe why I want to talk about this as a kind of internal theoretical bending of the stick, that we have a tendency to put such emphasis in radical theoretical debates on the left about the moment of political subjectivation and the moment of affirmation and so on and so forth. And then these questions, the questions of the political and social forms through which these relationships of exploitation and repression, etc., would be transformed and dismantled, become very secondary, as if all of the emphasis was on a kind of motivational issue. And that's, I guess, my sympathetic criticism of that kind of idea of communism mode, is that it seemed to depend on the notion that what has been absent is the idea in the sense of the motivation and the subjective energy, rather than a vocabulary of practices that can carry those ideas and not, yeah.
Ben sorayım.